In this video, we're shining the spotlight on the best player in the world, Magnus Carlsen, as we take a look at 5 fantastic games in the Sicilian Dragon, one of the sharpest openings in all of chess. The first opponent is the one and only Judit Polgar, and she starts e4. Magnus responds with c5, the Sicilian defense, and white plays knight f3, preparing a central advance. Black's d6 stops white from pushing e5, and white strikes with d4, looking to open up the center. Black obliges, capturing the pawn, and white recaptures, centralizing the knight. Knight f6 attacks e4, and white defends with knight c3. Then Magnus plays g6, the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense. In this opening, black will fianchetto his bishop on g7, castle kingside, and target white's center and queenside. White follows with bishop e3, with an idea to build a battery aimed at black's kingside. Black places his bishop on g7, and white's f3 solidifies her center while stopping black from placing his knight on g4, where it would attack the bishop. Black develops his other knight to c6, and white carries on with her plan of queen d2, which not only prepares queenside castling, but creates the option of moving the bishop to a6 in order to exchange black's important dark-squared bishop. Magnus castles his king to safety, and white cannot play bishop h6 just yet because black would take it, and after the white queen would capture, the knight on d4 would be left hanging. So, white proceeds development with bishop c4, stopping black from playing a d5 pawn break, and black brings his final minor piece out with bishop d7. Then white castles queenside, setting the stage for a sharp middle game with opposite sides castling. Black slides his rook over to c8, indirectly hitting the white bishop, so white cautiously returns it to b3. Black's knight e5 looks to jump into c4, where it could cause some trouble, and white begins operations on the kingside with g4. Black counters with b5, which is not actually a free pawn because were white to take it, black would take the pawn on f3 in exchange, and the white knight in the center would be overloaded with 2 squares to defend. Instead, white presses on with g5, and black hits back with b4. Taking the knight wouldn't be smart because black would capture on c3, hitting the queen, and white would have to damage her queenside pawn structure to recapture. So, white drops her knight to e2, and after black saves his knight, jumping it to h5, white fires out f4. Magnus leaps his knight to c4, forking the queen and bishop. White snaps off the knight with her other bishop, and black recaptures with the rook. White's b3 attacks it, and black drops it to c7, where he could still double up on the c-file in the future. After white moves her knight to g3, hitting black's knight, black slots his rook into the now undefended c3 square, opening his queen's path to a5. This does, however, allow white to open up black's kingside by capturing the knight, forcing black to recapture with the pawn. Before continuing the offensive, white prudently shifts her king to b1 in anticipation of black's next move, which is queen a5, drawing near the enemy king. White pushes f5, preparing to break open the black kingside, and black follows with rook c8, doubling up on the c-file. White's menacing f6 comes next, and black counters with e5. Now white can and probably should take the bishop, the reason being that after black would take the knight, white would recapture with the bishop, and it's actually quite important for white's bishop to be on d4. We'll see exactly why shortly, because in the game, white instead jumps her knight to f5. Magnus grabs the knight, and white recaptures with the pawn. Then he takes on c2, threatening a checkmate on a2, which forces white to take the rook. After black recaptures with the other rook, white takes it with her king, getting 2 rooks for the queen and pawn, which is an equal material exchange. But the king has left the a2 pawn undefended. Black snatches that, giving check, and now we see that were the white bishop on d4, it could block the check, and white's king would be reasonably safe. In this case, however, the king has to move, and it only has a couple options. Either one is about the same, but going to c1 means that the king wouldn't be able to run away long term. So white moves him to d3, where he is still able to escape to the other end of the board. Black could take the pawn on b3, but he decides to save his bishop that is still under attack. White shifts her rook to c1, grabbing the open c-file, and black plays d5, gaining space while opening his bishop. Now white's rook c8 looks scary, but black would have queen a6, forking the king and rook. White instead activates her other rook onto d1. Magnus plays the sneaky queen b2, covering the d4 square so that the threat is e4 checkmate. White sees this and moves the bishop to d2, which allows her king to safely run to e2. Black finally takes the pawn on b3 with check, and white shelters her king behind the bishop. Black pushes e4, threatening queen f3 check, which would come with all sorts of nasty ideas like king e1 and e3. So, white blocks the queen's vision with bishop e3. Black checks with queen b2, and white hides her king away on e1. Then black's queen swings over, winning the pawn on h2. White takes the pawn on d5 in exchange, and black returns his queen all the way to b8 in order to escort his b-pawn to promotion. White shifts her rook from c to d1, doubling up on the d-file, and black pushes his pawn one more square. White's rook d8 looks scary because it hits the queen while also threatening bishop c5 to win the pinned bishop. But black follows with queen b4 check while also covering the c5 square. The king sidesteps to f2. Now black has to be very precise because white is planning on lifting his rook to d4, hitting the queen, and then to d5 to allow his bishop to go to c5 safely, where things could get very dangerous for black. In this position, he only has one move that keeps his advantage. Can you find black's one and only winning move? Now black is up material, but we already saw that if he's too slow to convert his advantage, then white will play moves like rook 1 to d4, rook 1 to d5, and bishop c5, with all sorts of ideas to get at the black king. Black's main advantage here is his advanced b-pawn. So the move Magnus plays to win the game is b2. And how is white stopping that pawn? She slides her rook over to b1, blockading it, and black follows with queen a5, attacking the rook and the pawn. White moves her rook to a8, threatening the a7 pawn, and black takes on f5 with check, pushing the king to e1. He returns his queen to a5 with another check, and after the king goes back to f2, he drops his queen to c7 with queen c2, a brutal fork, coming next. Now white can't take the pawn because queen h2 would skewer the king and rook. So white slides the rook over to d1 with ideas of rook 1 to d8 and taking the bishop with checkmate. Black, however, doesn't give white a chance as he swoops his queen to h2, kicking the king to e1. The coup de grace is queen h1 check, and once the king moves, black sacrifices his queen for the rook, impelling black to resign the game. This removes the defense of the promotion square, so after white would take the queen, black would promote the pawn, getting a massive material advantage. The second opponent is the Super Grandmaster Teimour Radjabov, and he also meets the Sicilian Dragon with bishop e3. Magnus fianchettos the bishop, and white's f3 stops the knight from going to g4. Black continues with knight c6, pressuring white's center, and white plays queen d2, creating a battery aimed at black's kingside. After black castles, white develops the bishop to c4 to stop black's d5, and black brings his bishop out to d7. In anticipation of rook c8, white tucks his bishop away on b3, and lo and behold, black follows with rook c8. White begins hostilities, hauling out h4, and black stops him in his tracks with h5. Then white castles his king on the opposite end as black's. Black jumps his knight to e5, looking at c4, and black gets his bishop out of the forking zone, moving it to g5. Black lifts his rook to c5, both with ideas of doubling up on the c-file and defending his kingside laterally long term. White's king b1 gets the king out of any potential danger along the file, and black shifts his rook to e8, slightly improving, but mostly giving white a chance to make the first attacking move. Magnus is hoping that white will sacrifice a bunch of material to get at his king, and he will defend precisely before winning an advantageous endgame. And that's exactly what happens. White pushes g4, and black takes it. Then white strikes with h5. Black grabs it with the knight, enticing white to sacrifice the exchange. Black takes it with his pawn, and in compensation, white has the semi-open h-file, which he immediately takes advantage of, with an alarming attack approaching. Black doesn't have a way to save his pawn, so he quickly retreats his knight to defend his king. Black takes the pawn with his queen, and black lifts his queen to a5, doubling up on the pinned bishop. White defends it with f4. Now white's attack is actually not so easy to defend. He's threatening to take the knight since the f-pawn is pinned to the king, while also having ideas of pushing f5, swinging the other rook over to h1, all of which are concerning. So black does the sensible thing, sacrificing his rook for the bishop to shrink white's attack. White recaptures, and he's still threatening the knight thanks to the pin. So black pushes e6, stop breaking the pin, before white leaps his knight to f5, hitting the bishop and the pawn. Magnus takes the knight with his pawn, reopening the pin on his pawn to the king, and white takes the knight in return. But white is trading off too many pieces while still being down a pawn and probably about to lose more. Black lifts his bishop to e6, breaking white's pin, hence attacking the queen. She drops to h5, and black grabs a second pawn on e4. White can't even take it because black would grab the bishop, opening the rook's attack on the knight. Taking on d6 would also be dangerous because the back rank would be left undefended, and black would swing his queen over to f5 to exploit that, while preparing to push the pawn as well. White decides instead to keep attacking with rook f1. After black returns his queen to defend, white sacrifices his rook on f7. Black shouldn't take it with his bishop because white would grab it with the queen, pushing the king to h8, where he would get checkmated after queen h5, bishop h6, and queen takes h6, thanks to white's sniper bishop. Back to the game, Magnus sees this and grabs the bishop on b3 instead. White recaptures with the pawn, and black starts pushing his extra pawn. White gets his king off the back rank, avoiding any potential tactics, and black shifts his rook to f8 to get rid of white's powerful rook. White doesn't want to give black the fully open f-file, so he trades the rook and the king recaptures. Then white drops the queen to g4, keeping an eye on black's pawn. So black pushes the other one. White counters with g6, trying to build a net around the black king, and black just presses on with e2. Now black has to be very precise here. He dodges queen f3 with king to e8, and meets queen f7 with king to d8. Queen g8 check is sidestepped with king d7, and queen f7 blocked by queen e7. White follows with queen f5 check, and it's black's time to shine. He has one move here to completely win the game. Can you find black's best move? Now black has 5 legal moves, so the easiest way to find the best is to evaluate all of them. While king to c7 would still allow black to get a queen, he would be losing his old queen to knight d5, a royal fork. King to e8 would let white draw by going back and forth from c8 to e6 with his queen. Going to c6 would be met by queen c8 and queen e8, winning the pawn. Similarly, blocking with the queen would see queen b5, forking the king and the pawn yet again. This leaves one move, and the one Magnus plays, king to d8. White has no combinations here. His best move is to just give up the knight for the pawn. Instead, he tries queen a5. Black calmly blocks with b6. Queen d5 looks to jump into a8, but that's not really a problem. Black just promotes to a second queen. He meets queen a8 check with king d7 and queen b7 with king e8. White could keep checking, but two black queens will quickly come back to guard the king. There's no hope for white, so he resigns the game. The third opponent is Livia Dieter Nizipinu, and he meets the Sicilian Dragon with bishop e2. After Magnus's bishop g7, white castles, and he meets black's knight c6, with knight b3 immediately ducking the exchange. Black castles, and white shifts his king to h1, preparing an f4 advance. Black's a6 looks to build something up on the queen side, and white fires out f4. Black's b5 is followed by bishop f3, staring down the long diagonal. Black fights back with bishop b7, and after a4 trying to open up the a-file, black gains space with b4 hitting the knight. It jumps to d5, and black exchanges knights. The pawn recaptures, hitting black's knight, so it jumps to a5, hitting white's knight. White c3 opens his queen's defense of the knight so he could develop her were black to capture. Still, this sacrifices a pawn, and black takes on c3. However, after white recaptures, he opts not to take the pawn, choosing activity over material as he slides his rook over to c8 onto the semi-open c-file. White shifts his rook to b1, threatening to take the knight and then the bishop. So black drops his bishop to a8 before white reroutes his knight to d2. Now, at any point, Magnus could take the pawn, but he continues improving his position as he jumps his knight to c4. Knight e3, forking the queen and rook, is the threat. So white takes the knight, and black recaptures with the rook, putting pressure on two more weak points. White develops his bishop to d2, and black swoops his queen to a5, attacking both d5 and a4. At this point, white has 3 pawns under fire, so it's pointless for white to defend any single one of them. He shifts his queen to e1, going after black's pawns. Black takes on d5, and white dodges the bishop exchange, counter-attacking the rook with bishop e2. Black lets it go, as he grabs the pawn on a4 with his queen. White takes the rook, and black recaptures with the bishop, attacking the white rook, who skips to f2. Now black got 2 pawns and a piece for the rook, which is an equal material exchange. But he plans to use his pawn advantage to win in the endgame. First, he saves his pawn that was under attack. White lifts his bishop to e3, planning a bishop exchange in the future. Black's bishop d5 sets its sights on the king, and white slides his rook over from f to b8, doubling up on the b-file. Magnus swings his queen to e4, creating a battery aimed at g2, which will keep white's pieces tied up. White lifts his queen to d2, coordinating with his bishop onto d4. Black gives his king air with h5, and after white's bishop d4 offering an exchange, black declines with bishop h6 attacking f4. White drops his bishop right back to e3 to defend, and black plants the seeds of his victory as he pushes his pawn one step closer to glory. White jumps the rook to b8, and black lifts his king to h7 off the back rank. White plays h3, giving his king some air, and after black takes the rook on b8, he recaptures with his other rook, landing it behind enemy lines. Black drops his bishop back to g7, and white on autopilot puts his bishop right back on d4, offering an exchange. But this is a slight slip-up, and black has a move here to take the upper hand in the game. Can you find black's winning move? Black's main goal is to push his a-pawn. The problem with pushing it a moment ago would have been rook b4, which would fork the queen and the pawn. Yet, after white's last move, white is able to eliminate that possibility altogether, and the move Magnus plays to do that is bishop takes d4. The queen is responsible for guarding against checkmate, so white is forced to recapture with the pawn. And black pushes a4, meaning it's white's own pawn, stopping white from using his one defensive resource, which is rook b4. Black is a couple moves away from getting his pawn to a2, defended by his bishop, and with his queen stuck defending against checkmate, and the rook unable to get to a8, white just has no way of stopping that from happening. He gets his king off the back rank, and black pushes the pawn. Rook b4 trying to get behind it is a little too late as the pawn goes one more square. White's final attempt is rook a4, but it's met by queen b1, and white calls it a day, resigning the game. His only way of stopping the pawn from promoting is queen to c3. But then black would move his queen to f1, threatening both checkmate and the pawn on f4. White could play queen b2 defending, but black would win the pawn, with more attacking opportunities to come, all while white's pieces are tied up defending the pawn forever, with the only way of getting out being giving up material. LD Nizipinu makes a return for the penultimate game, and this time he meets the Sicilian Dragon with the most common move, bishop e3. Black fianchettos his bishop, and white plays f3 before black develops his knight to c6. White's queen d2 creating a battery is followed by both sides castling, albeit on opposite ends. Then black breaks with d5. White sidesteps his king to b1 because black actually can't take on e4. Otherwise, white would take on c6, opening up two attackers on the queen. This means black wouldn't be able to recapture the knight, and were he to exchange queens, white would first take on e7 with check, saving his knight before recapturing the queen, ultimately emerging up a knight. Back to the game. So Magnus embraces the central tension, shifting his rook to b8 in preparations for a queenside offensive. White jumps his knight from d to b5, and he meets black's a6 with knight a7, defended by his bishop and hitting the black knight and bishop. Black doesn't react, pushing e6 to reinforce his pawn. White's g4 kickstarts an attack on the king side, and black shifts his rook to e8, anticipating the opening of the e-file. White's g5 kicks the knight to h5, and white gets his bishop off the e-file since he plans to open it up soon. Black develops his bishop, sacrificing a pawn, as white takes on d5, and after black recaptures, he takes the second pawn with his queen, with an attack on black's bishop. Black jumps his knight to e4, defending it, while getting out of the white knight's vision, and we're starting to notice that the knight is going to have a hard time getting out. White drops his queen to b3, creating a pin on the bishop to black's queen, and black quickly gets out of that, capturing the pawn on g5 with his queen. He meets white's knight e4, attacking the queen, with queen f4 counterattacking the pawn. White defends with his bishop, and after black moves his bishop to e6, hitting the queen, she sidesteps to a3. Magnus leaps his knight to c4, hitting the queen again, and white swipes it off the board with his bishop. After black recaptures, white jumps his knight to d6, forking the bishop and the rook. Black cleverly drops his bishop to f8, pinning the knight to the queen, and white hits back with rook d4, attacking both the queen and the bishop. White drops his queen to e5, keeping an eye on the knight, so that after white takes the bishop, leaving its defense, black is able to pick it up with his bishop while attacking the queen. White moves her to d3, and black moves his bishop back to f8, clearing the d-file for his rook. White's a4 gives the king a flight square, and black slides his rook over from b to d8, hitting the queen. She runs to b3, hitting b7, and black shifts his queen to d5, defending. White's rook to c3 offers an exchange of queens, which black declines, moving her to d2, with an attack on the bishop, who counters with bishop e3. Black shifts his queen to e2, attacking the now undefended f3 pawn, and there isn't really a good way for white to defend it. His best bet is probably moving his bishop to c5, but after black's queen to g2, pushing the rook to c1 and knight f4, threatening a fork on e2, white could be in some trouble. Black would quickly get his knight back into the game, and Black would quickly get his knight back into the game, and once the dust would settle, we'd end up in a position where white's knight is still stuck on the rim, whereas black's is incredibly active. Back to the game. Instead of this, white chooses bishop b6 to defend his pawn while attacking the rook on d1. But shortly after playing this move, white realizes he made a big mistake and he resigns the game. Black has a tremendous tactical sequence here that wins the game. Can you find black's one and only winning move? Now the reason black is winning here is really deep, but it's that the white bishop had to go to c5 to block the black bishop's attack along the diagonal. The way Magnus would exploit this oversight would be rook d1 check. White can't move his king without hanging the rook, so he would be forced to exchange the rooks, and black would recapture with the queen, pushing the king to a2. Black would follow with the only move, rook e1, creating a brutal battery along the first rank. The threat is queen a1 checkmate, so white would be forced to move his queen to give his king a flight square. And with black's sniper bishop, white would have only so many options. She has to leave the defense of the b-pawn, and let's say she would go to c4. Queen a1 check would force the king to b3, after which rook b1 would create an unmeetable threat on the b2 pawn. The threat at this point would be rook b2 checkmate, so the queen would have to move before black would take the pawn with the queen, and once the king would move, black would at the very least win the bishop, which is a decisive material advantage. The final opponent is Ted Berenzi, and he meets the Sicilian Dragon with bishop e3. Magnus develops his bishop, and the players go through the typical moves of the Sicilian Dragon main line. White's bishop c4 stops a d5 pawn break, and after black develops his bishop, white castles queenside, setting the stage for a sharp middle game. Black swoops his queen to a5, immediately drawing near the enemy king, and white cautiously drops his bishop back to b3. Black slides his rook over to the semi-open c-file, and white launches a pawn storm with g4. Black's knight e5 pressures f3 and c4, and white prudently shifts his king to b1. Black follows with b5, advancing on the queenside, and in anticipation of b4, white jumps his knight to d5, leading to an exchange of queens before the white rook recaptures on d2. Then black takes the knight, and after white recaptures with the pawn, he lets loose a second pawn on the queenside with a5. White pushes a3 so that his bishop doesn't get trapped, and black shifts his rook from a to b8, enticing white to push c3 to stop black from pushing b4. Magnus bursts out with b4 anyway. This leads to several exchanges as white takes once, black recaptures, and white takes again, which is a slight mistake as black takes back with the rook while posing some complex questions to white. For one, the white knight is overloaded, so black could capture the pawn on f3, and were white to recapture, black would take the bishop, emerging up one pawn. So, in light of this, white moves his rook over to f1 to defend, but then the bishop swoops into b5, attacking the rook. Were the knight to take the bishop, then black wouldn't take it back, but he would take white's bishop, and then end up winning a piece with a fork on the bishop and the knight. Instead, white dodges the attack on his rook, and black slots his knight into d3, hitting it again. This also opens the bishop with a threat to capture the knight on d4 to remove the defender of white's bishop before capturing that. So white settles for this, where he takes the bishop with his knight. Black could take it with the rook, but he opts to take the bishop, which defends his knight, while still keeping an attack on the white knight. So white drops his knight back to d4, hitting the enemy rook. At this point, black has to be very precise, because there's only one move that wins the game. Can you find black's best move? Both rooks are under attack, so black shouldn't be too quick to take white's rook. The move Magnus plays to get a material advantage is bishop takes d4. This takes a full piece while saving his rook, all while the white rook is still under attack. Were white to move the rook, then black would just be a piece up. So white grabs the bishop before black takes the rook and white recaptures. After this sequence, black is up the exchange, and he begins converting this advantage with rook d3, skewering the bishop and pawn. White drops the bishop to c3, and while black could win a second pawn, he decides to trade down into a simpler endgame by capturing the bishop on c3. White recaptures with the pawn, and black takes it with the rook, emerging up a pawn, with a second one on d5 about to fall as well. White can't even defend the pawn because it would hang the pawn on f3. So he shifts his rook a square, attacking e7. After black shifts his king to f8, defending, white decides to throw in the towel and resigns. There's no way he can save both his f-pawn and his d-pawn, and while many would choose to play on, white is convinced he won't be able to survive in an endgame down 2 pawns against the likes of Magnus Carlsen. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.